Hi, welcome to the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. In today's video, I want to look at the limiters that are on offer in the MPC standalone. Now, to be honest, there's not an awful lot of options on offer, but what there is on offer gets the job done, gets you in the ballpark. So let's jump in. Now, before we get into it, I just want to give you a very basic outline of what we use limiters for. We'll use them to catch the loudest peaks of a track and to make sure that they don't go over 0 dBFS or whatever you set the ceiling at. We'll also use them to increase perceived loudness by increasing the levels of the quieter parts of a track. Ultimately, our aim is to bring them up to commercial loudness without distortion. That's a very, very basic explanation of what limiting does. If you want an even more basic explanation, they make things loud. Now today I'm going to exclusively look at the air limiter. Now there are other ways to limit in the MPC, which I'll explain later, but I just want to focus on the actual air limiter in this video. Now before we really get into it, I've lost count of how many times clients have sent me premasters where they've bounced the track with a limiter on. There's no headroom, the track is absolutely smashed, and I have no headroom to work with whatsoever. So I will say, if you're considering sending your track to a mastering engineer to be finished off, make sure you bounce your track without the limiter on and give yourself plenty of headroom. Minus 6 dB is enough for a mastering engineer to work with. So I just want to point that out. So let's get into the air limiter. Now I want to show two different examples of using the limiter. One will be on the master bus as the last effect in your chain, and the other one will be on mix bus where you're using it to get maximum loudness on your tracks, but I'll explain that later. Starting off with the mix bus, I have a pre-master from a client here which I mastered for him, but this is obviously the pre-master, so let's just pretend that it's a track that you've made in your MPC and you want to get maximum loudness out of it. So if we go into the limiter, now I've only got the limiter on there. Now normally in mastering I would obviously use EQ, possibly some compression, and then I would have the limiter at the end. I may also use very occasionally some saturation, whatever plugins I might need to get the best out of the master. But I just want to demonstrate the limiter today and not go into too much detail on actually mastering a track as such, but just really show you what the air limiter does. Very, very basic controls. But that doesn't mean that you can't completely mess a track up, because things can go wrong very, very quickly if you start pushing levels too high. So let's just have a quick listen to the track. Now, this client gave me plenty of headroom to work with. So, which is what I like. I don't want the track to be absolutely crushed because it doesn't give me any room to work. And basically when you're limiting, you're going to be reducing the dynamic range of the signal. So you want some headroom to work with so you can still, get the best out of the track, and you don't want it to be completely crushed before it goes to mastering. So really my aim is to get the track up to the loudest perceived loudness, but keep it under 0 dB. But what we often do in mastering, we won't master to 0 dB, we'll master to something slightly under, just to give it a little bit of room for any kind of errors that may be in the WAV once you've bounced it. I don't want to go into too much detail on that either, but just, basically you want to take the ceiling just back a little bit, minus 0.3, minus 0.5, we're going to go minus 0.2 here. We'll get to the gain in a second. With the look ahead on limiters, what it's really doing is it will introduce a very, very slight amount of latency, but basically it's looking at the peaks ahead and giving the limiter a chance to catch those peaks. It's quite important in digital limiting. I'm not sure how accurate the look ahead is on this, but what I've found is that you have to kind of dial it in and listen for distortion. This is the most important thing when you're using a limiter, is you have to really, really listen for distortion, because you want to get it as loud as you possibly can, but you don't want it to be distorted. So constantly be listening for distortion. Listen in the low end, that's really when things start to break up the most, in the low end. So we're going to go with look ahead on 5 milliseconds. Now the release time as well, the quicker that you have the release, very basically the quicker that you have the release, the louder you're going to be able to push the signal, but the higher the chances are that you're going to introduce distortion. So again, I'll tend to start with around about 75 milliseconds, depending on the genre, but it's a good ballpark figure to start with. But there's no preset that you can apply to every single track, because every single track is different. So you need to learn about what the release does, what the look ahead does, and apply it to each individual track. So we're going to start with this, and then what you're basically going to do with this particular limiter, not all limiters work the same, but this particular one, is you're going to push the signal, you're going to raise the volume of your source, and you're going to be pushing into the limiter. And when the peaks start hitting where you've set the ceiling, you're going to start getting reduction in volume, but really what it's actually doing is reducing the dynamic range. So it's going to start sounding louder because you're bringing up the quieter parts of the signal, but it's still not going to go past 0.2 decibels. That's the point. So let's have a listen, and we'll start pushing the gain. And like I said, listen for distortion. If you really are going for maximum loudness, which most people do nowadays, that's what they want, for it to be able to sit alongside other tracks on the radio, etc. You want to get as much volume out of it, but you have to listen for that distortion. And with this LF mono setting here, basically what it's doing is it's making whatever frequency you set here, anything below that is going to make it in mono. Now that's an old technique that comes from when we used to press on vinyl. You wanted to not have too much low end, because basically if you had too much low end, the needle could literally jump out of the groove. So it is still something that we apply nowadays in mastering. It's better to have the low end in mono, but it's not absolutely essential, and rules are there to be broken. There is no default, there is no right or wrong. So generally I would probably look at round about 80 hertz, keeping that in mono. But again, it's not a rule. You can play with it. It's just I tend to do that on a lot of the genres that I master. I tend to master hip hop and house, that kind of stuff. So it's a better idea to keep the low end in mono most of the time. So if we take that up to around about 80 hertz. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start raising the volume, raising the gain, and pushing into the limiter, and then look how it starts reducing here as the peaks are being hit by the gain increase. But you'll also see on the out here that it will not go over 0. Well, it won't go over 0.2, because that's the ceiling that I've set. And it's very important that you set the ceiling. I wouldn't leave it on 0. I'd bring it down a little bit just to give yourself a bit of room for any errors. Okay, so at gain 9.7, we're starting to see a little bit of reduction. So now the level's been pushed up and the peaks are starting to activate the limiter. But I can go a little bit louder than that. Okay, at 11.6, I think I'm reaching as far as I can push this without doing any more work on it in terms of EQ and that kind of stuff. Just a straight pre-master, pushing the gain. I find that 11.6, once I've gone over 11.6, I can start hearing a little bit of distortion. I'm not sure you're going to be able to hear it on YouTube, but I'll push it up a little bit further just so that maybe you can hear it. But I'm hearing distortion, so I wouldn't push it any more than that. Now what I would normally do when I'm mastering, obviously I do my mastering on a computer, so I can A and B the levels, I can hear what the limiter is doing. Now unfortunately on the Akai you don't have auto gain, so if I was to take the limiter out it would instantly drop the level, and it's really difficult to really gauge what the limiter is doing, how it's affecting the transients, what the reduction is doing, because what's happening is if you're pushing down on those peaks, as you're pushing into it, those peaks are being rounded off as such. Not completely cut off, that's what a clipper does, but a limiter will round them off almost the same way a clipper would. So you are going to affect the transients. Things are going to start sounding a bit spongy and a bit rounded off, and you'll lose like the impact of the transients on your snares and your kicks, or whatever instruments and stuff. So you have to listen out for that as well. But trust your ears. There is a simple thing that I would say to the students that I work with mastering would be, use your ears, and if it starts sounding crap, then just roll it back a little bit. It's pretty simple. If you want to get maximum loudness, just keep pushing, and then as soon as things start breaking up a little bit, then just bring it, reel it in. But also, you do need to pay attention, like I said, to the transients and how the limiter is affecting it. But it's difficult on the Akai to gauge, to reference to A and B, because you don't have auto gain. Maybe that'll be something that they'll build in the future, so it's easier to compare your plugins. So what I've done, just very quickly to show you, is I've bounced the premaster. I bounced it inside the MPC, and I've added it to another audio track to give you a visual impression of what it's done to the signal. So here's what the premaster looks like basically, and then if I go here and open this up, that's in exactly the same place in the song. You can see. So you can see how much that has increased the level of the signal. And quite often you will see tracks that have been mastered, if you were to download them from iTunes or whatever, and you were to put them in a program where you can see the visual outlay of the waveform, you will see that they're just pretty much like a massive block. If I move along, the difference. This is a breakdown in the song. If I go to this one, you can see the breakdown in the song there. So you can see that it's brought up the quieter parts from the pre-master. That's the difference. That's the pre-master, and that's it after mastering. So another way to use a limiter is to use it in mixing. So what I've done here is I've just loaded up some drums, just made a quick drum beat, and the point of it is that this is a technique which gets used in a lot of modern dance genres, drum and bass, trap, that kind of thing. And what the mixing engineer does is he clips pretty much every single channel. So he's bringing every channel up to just under 0 dB, and then he will make a balance. So you're getting maximum loudness out of everything. So you can do something similar on the MPC. For instance, here we have this drum beat. I have on the effects, I have some EQ, which I've just done a little bit of work with, a compressor, a general EQ, and then you finish up with the limiter. And it's the same process. And basically what I'm doing is I'm going to take the drum bus, I'm going to push it to its absolute maximum, set the ceiling at 0.3, and I'll take the drum bus and I'll push it to its maximum. I'll take the vocals, I'll push them to their maximum, etc, etc, etc. And it's just a technique that people use, where they use limiters in mixing, or a compressor with a really high ratio, which pretty much does the same thing. And you get the maximum level out of each individual track, and then you'll mix it. There's a guy online whose name completely escapes me, who does a lot of videos about this mixing using clipping, where he clips every single channel and then he mixes like that. And because you've clipped every single channel, you're reducing the dynamic range of every single track. Therefore, when mixed together, you've reduced the dynamic range throughout, and you can push for even more loudness without distortion, because you're basically limiting through each stage through the track. So when you get to the end, I mean, graphically the waveform just looks like a rectangle, but you're getting -4 LUFS on something like that. People, mastering engineers, might aim for -12, -10, -8 on some loud dance records, but these guys who are using this clipping procedure, they can get, I mean, it's ridiculous. I've seen, there's a video online where somebody's getting -2 LUFS, and it's crazy, and there's still no distortion at all. So if that's your thing, this is a technique that you can use. So I'm getting some decibels reduction there. So basically I'm pushing the drums into the limiter and shaving off the peaks. It's gluing everything together. It is affecting the transient slightly. I can't really show that because I can't A and B it properly on on an MPC because you don't have auto gain, as I explained. But you know, it's a good way to, if you want to build a mix for maximum loudness. I haven't actually made a mix in the MPC where I've used that technique throughout, so I don't know how it would come out. Maybe it'll be something that I'll do in the future. So there you have it, the air limiter. I do want to quickly point out that limiters are basically compressors with a much higher ratio. So theoretically you could use the air compressor in the same way that you would use a limiter, set a very high ratio, and it would give you a little bit more control over the attack and the release, which is something that you don't have so much control over in the air limiter. As a mastering engineer, I would say that this is probably not the best way to have a track finished to a mastered commercial level. You know, the best thing to do ultimately is to bounce the track out as a pre-master and either master it yourself in the box or send it to a mastering engineer. But it does give you a decent finished product. It's good enough to play out. It's good enough to send to a label as a demo, and you know, and ultimately it probably is good enough to release as a track. It's just something that I think if you want the absolute best out of your track, it's probably best to get it properly mastered by an engineer. Just to think that you can even, you know, master a track in your MPC, to me is absolutely crazy. To think, you know, when I first bought my MPC 60 in 1989, the limitations I had, I would never have dreamt that I could completely make a track in my MPC, mix it, and then take it virtually to a level of commercially mastered as a finished track. I mean, it's crazy. So thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more mixing, mastering and MPC tutorials and reviews. This is the Crates Motel. My name's Conan. Till next time.